Welcome, everybody. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. We're in our penultimate session for our course on Little Essays Towards Truth by Aleister Crowley. So, of course, all of the sessions of this are available with the links that I've been sending you, so you can keep up retroactively. And we're discussing the two next to the last chapters, which are silence and love. So first, let's jump right into silence. I'm going to bring up the text. And share my screen. Okay, here we go. So Stephen, you're first in the queue. These first two paragraphs are a little bit rhetorical and also kind of misleading, but I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Go ahead and read these first two paragraphs.
Of all the magical and mystical virtues, of all the graces of the soul, of all the attainments of the spirit, none has been so misunderstood, even when at all apprehended, as silence. It would not be possible to enumerate the common errors. Nay, it may be said to think of it all as itself an error, for its nature is pure being, that is to say nothing, so that it is beyond all intellection or intuition. Thus, the utmost of our essay can only be a certain wardenship, as if it were a tiling of the lodge wherein the mystery of silence may be consummated.
So in Freemasonry, the tiler is the person who stands at the door and admits the candidate. So they're guardian of the sacred space of the temple. It's called tiling the temple, and therefore has that magical significance. Now, Crowley is giving you a little bit of a clue here where he talks about how the thing that's supposedly beyond all, I say supposedly beyond all intellection or intuition, although it turns out that it isn't. It is, in fact, comprehensible, is this thing called pure being. But then he says that is to say nothing. Okay, he's already alluding to the basic Hegelian transition from pure being, which because it's, again, allegedly beyond all intellection or intuition, therefore has no qualities and is therefore equivalent, Hegel argues, to nothing. But then if that's the case, then the real category, Hegel argues, is becoming. And this is basically the same, or something like the same argument that Crowley has for what he calls the Kabbalistic zero, which is a nothingness that is such a pure nothingness that it necessarily does not exist in any way. And so what actually exists is being, you see. So it's a kind of nothingness that negates itself and therefore is equivalent to the infinity of actual reality. So therefore, its pure being may be beyond all intellection or intuition, and nothing may share certain of those qualities of non-specificity. But becoming, the third category, the two of the 0 equals 2 equation, that has definite qualities and attributes that at least phenomenologically can be described, because we are the ones who are experiencing those qualities, and therefore using language, the great magical agent, we can metaphorically symbolize reality and our relationship to reality in those terms. So meaning linguistic symbolic terms, meaning metaphorical terms, meaning terms that are not truth with a capital T, but are open us up to many different modes of pragmatic or practical truths, plural, that allow us to maneuver through what William James calls the pluriverse, meaning the complex diversity of our being in relationship to other beings, and then we're all in this great constellation of what in the Book of the Law is called the company of heaven, and of which we all have our unique kind of role to play in that drama. All the world's a stage, as Shakespeare says. Okay, so what role does silence play in that? So by silence, we'll come back to the screen here in a moment. So by silence, Crowley means the smoothly running equilibrium of a complex system. He'll say this in the next paragraph or two, but I just want to anticipate the point that he's going to make. And this complex system, from our point of view, from the point of view of our existence, is our human existence in all of its complexity. And now what's interesting about this view, where silence is a kind of smooth equilibrium of a complex system, rather than an apprehension of some kind of simple transcendental reality, a kind of pure noetic consciousness without content, or something like that. Which, by the way, phenomenology denies that there can be such a thing, because it's a basic premise of the phenomenological method that all conscious states have intentionality, meaning they have a kind of aboutness to them. Conscious states are always about some content. Now, it could be argued that samadhi has a kind of content. Its content is mind as such, the total field of experience of mind. And so, but that is also a kind of content, it could be argued. So that's to say that there is a way of looking at samadhi where it's not an exception to the rule that conscious states always have some kind of content, but is rather the kind of exemplar of that condition, namely that the content of the state of mind of samadhi is state of mind as such, is being as such, in kind of its broadest encompassing mental totality being grasped. And the ability to sort of grasp that speculative totality in a kind of gestalt is what Crowley calls the true will. And it has this quality of silence because it involves a kind of smoothness to it. It's a kind of, it reaches a point where it becomes a kind of smooth intuition, where you're in the flow and you're in your existence, being who you are and doing what you're supposed to do. And this isn't like interrupted by confusion or distraction. And this is therefore a kind of like beatitude that Crowley has talked about in earlier chapters. And therefore also this aligns with his concept of trance, which he's been discussing throughout the text. Okay, so this view of silence is in many practical ways compatible with, and yet it's also very, at the same time, philosophically different from the kind of silence that is cultivated in, say, medieval Christian mysticism, where there's what's called a kind of apophatic silence. You're trying to quiet down the mind, usually through prayer or quiet meditation. And this type of meditative mysticism, where it's a kind of quietism, has its roots in Neoplatonic conceptions of the divine as a kind of otherworldly supermind that you're trying to get into some kind of telepathic communication with, or more properly, that because your own soul is of the same form as the absolute mind of the transcendent one, that if you still your mind, it will reflect the nature of that reality in it. And so your mind is like the traditional metaphor. It's like a dirty mirror that you have to polish, and then it will reflect the divine mind within your mind, because your soul and the divine are of the same supernatural substance. That's the traditional Platonic viewpoint, which is also the viewpoint of at least, most common forms of traditional Christian medieval mysticism. Okay. So this is a kind of silence that's about quieting the bodily desires and mental thought. Now, in contrast, the thelemic conception of silence as a mystical trance is both active and passionate. So the silence in question is silence of the distractions from the absorption into your temporal historicity in phenomenological terms, where you're absorbed in your activities that represent your most authentic potentiality for being, your true will, in other words. So you're absorbed and caught up in these activities, so that distraction from that is eliminated. Your purposiveness is clear and present, and you're focused on that. And so distractions from that are silenced. And then it's also, of course, passionate, because the expression of the true will is an expression of what Crowley has called energy with a capital E, which is basically a structuring of libido, of affectivity, to then have a directed purpose, love under will, in other words. So rather than quieting the passions, this is a focusing and structuring and directedness of passion too, until it becomes a kind of white hot, one-pointed somatic intensity. And so you're directed towards your true will with creative passion, so that you are fully tuned into your deepest motivation of being. And this is the goal of magical practice in a thelemic context, to know and to do your true will by seeking trance, but avoiding obsession, by achieving ecstatic self-transcendence and self-growth and openness to your experience, and then engagement with that experience in a highly structured, coherent way, as opposed to obsession, which is a kind of addictive or compulsive or neurotic way of failing to respond to experience in a way that is authentic or appropriate, but instead is locked up in addictive symptoms that deflect or defeat our deeper purposes, our deeper potential true will. So let's take a look now back at our text. Hillary, if you could pick up where it says, for this attitude, there is a sound traditional authority.
For this attitude, there is sound traditional authority. For Harpocrates, god of silence, is called the Lord of defense and protection. But his nature is by no means that negative and passive silence which the word commonly connotes, for he is the all-wandering spirit, the pure and perfect knight-errant, who answers all enigmas and opens the closed portal of the king's daughter. But silence in the vulgar sense is not the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. It is that which is created by that answer. For silence is the equilibrium of perfection.
Okay, there's our definition. Silence is equilibrium. Keep going.
So that Harpocrates is the omniform, the universal key to every mystery soever.
Okay, let's pause there and make sure I'm on the right view. Yes. Okay, so again, we see him repeating the points that I just made. Silence is active, passionate, and the equilibrium as a condition of equilibrium where those two things are able to be freely expressed through ecstatic trance. Okay, now he also introduces the theme of and this occurs frequently in his writing, the idea of the thelemic magician as a kind of knight errant. Okay, what does that mean? Well, he's referring to the mythology of the Grail quest and of the Knights of the Grail, of which Parzival is one of the Grail Knights. He's sometimes called the pure fool, which in Arabic, or I think it's Persian actually, is Parsifal, which is how Wagner spells Parzival's name in his famous opera. And so these are forms or versions of the Fool card in tarot that Crowley is equating Parsifal as the type of the Grail Knight, and therefore the ideal of the thelemic magician as a knight errant, meaning an adventuring knight who sallies forth in search of the adventure of life. And the theme here is that of course the Holy Grail represents Neshama, or the Holy Spirit, as the feminine presence of God within, or the divine within the world. And so the knight is attempting to, with their phallic lance or sword, to unite that with the yonic cup, as it were, representing the one way of thinking about sexual theurgy in relationship to the formula of tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, the father, the king and the queen, and then the knight is the Vav, is the son, which then quests in search of the daughter, to then set the daughter upon the throne of the mother representing Neshama, and therefore involving the completion of this kind of circuit of being that has a phase where it withdraws into the Kabbalistic zero, and it's a kind of quietude, but then also an issuing forth into some kind of reproductive of action in the future. So it's both reproductive and also has this moment of mystical withdrawal as well, both together. And those are the 0 and the 2 in the 0 equals 2 equation, which are the equal sign tells us twin phases or ways of looking at the same thing. Okay, so Crowley now introduces the theme of what he calls innocence. Okay, now this, like chastity, is going to turn out not to necessarily be the traditional notion. But anyway, Henry, if you can pick up where it says, when we inquire.
When we inquire more closely into his symbolism,
This is Harpocrates or Parsifal, the knight errant.
the first quality which engages our attention is doubtless his innocence. Not without deep wisdom is he called twin of Horus, and this is the Aeon of Horus. It is he who sent forth Aiwas, his minister, to proclaim its advent. The fourth power of the Sphinx is silence. To us then who aspire to this power as the crown of our work, it will be of utmost value to attain his innocence in all its fullness. We must understand, first of all, that the root of moral responsibility, on which man stupidly prides himself as distinguishing him from the other animals, is restriction, which is the word of sin. Indeed, there is truth in the Hebrew fable that the knowledge of good and evil brings forth death. To regain innocence is to regain Eden. We must learn to live without the murderous consciousness that every breath we draw swells the sails which bear our frail vessels to the port of the grave. We must cast out fear by love, seeing that every act is an orgasm. Their total issue cannot be but birth. Also, love is the law. Thus, every act must be righteousness and truth. By certain meditations, this may be understood and established, and this ought to be done so thoroughly that we become unconscious of our sanctification, for only then is innocence made perfect. This state is, in fact, a necessary condition of any proper contemplation of what we are accustomed to consider the first task of the aspirant, the solution of the question, what is my true will? For until we become innocent, we are certain to try to judge our will by some canon of what seems, quote, right or, quote, wrong. In other words, we are apt to criticize our will from the outside, whereas true will should spring, a fountain of light, from within, and flow unchecked, seething with love into the ocean of life.
Okay, so first of all, I want to point out that he uses this word sanctification. We're going to return to that because that's a Christian theological term that he's appropriating and reinterpreting in a magical sense. But first, the basic import of this derives, of course, from psychoanalysis, which is Freud's discovery that the superego, what he calls the superego or censor, which is the inherited sense of right and wrong, basically, that we derive from our primary socialization, usually within our family, but also to some extent from of course, from the larger society around us. And Freud's argument that is then further taken up and radicalized by Jacques Lacan later in the French psychoanalytic tradition, is that this programming of the superego, which relates to the function of what Lacan calls the imaginary, which is the way that our psyche absorbs and is structured or programmed by what he calls the symbolic order, which is the world of language uses that we learn from socialization. So we're kind of initiated into a world that's linguistically defined and structured as a human person that cognizes their world and experience through linguistic categories. And so the rules that we learn, and this is the payoff, is arbitrary. In other words, just because we're socialized a particular way to have a particular moral sense doesn't mean that that moral sense is correct or appropriate. In fact, it's very important to successful adult socialization that we become self-critical of the particular emotionally based programming that we receive as children, so that we can learn to discriminate when emotional impulses that we receive are or are not actually socially appropriate. Something that many people as adults are not able to do very effectively, just to mention that. I'm sure we've all noticed that from time to time. But the point here is that therapy, like magic, is a kind of analysis of and critique of and potentially reprogramming of this transcendental linguistic horizon that informs how we experience our subjectivity. And so we're not just bound by conventional morality in that point. In fact, conventional morality that we inherit from our society can often be extremely limited, unintelligent, bigoted, inappropriate, and stupid. And so we're called upon as magicians, as well as just, good citizens, to try to be smarter sometimes than the conventional wisdom that we inherit. And so this is what Crowley also means when he talks about how magic is opposed to what he calls bourgeois values. He means conventional conservative morality, which is too pat, too limited, too simplistic to actually function for anybody who's trying to have an actually more deeper creative relationship with reality and their potential for existence. So it's very much part of the first task of the aspirant to solve the question of what is their true will, to break away from the conventional canon of what seems to be right or wrong, and instead to try to become the pure fool that is more radically open to their experience, but not just arbitrarily, in a kind of intelligent and critical way. And then to quest after neshama, which is the actual sense of legitimate wholeness of the psyche, both in a moral and emotional sense, as well as in other senses, that can actually be the kind of gestalt mental function that can actually legitimately direct us to make good choices in our lives. And so but that has to be built up. It's not just something that we immediately acquire. Okay, so then, so again, when he talks about restriction, he's talking about, in a Freudian sense, the superego inhibitions that we have that have to be overcome. So, for example, in Crowley's case, as someone who's a gay male, some of this restriction was heterosexual norms that were part of the society that he was growing up in, that he had to kind of release himself from the shackles of that that particular type of normativity in order to explore his own queer nature as an aspect of his true will. And that might or might not apply to other magicians, but it's useful to point that out, because that is particularly for Crowley, that's a kind of exemplar for him of what he's looking for when he's talking about breaking free of conventional morality in order to find your deeper self. For him, that meant finding the deeper truth of his sexual orientation, and for other people, that could be whatever is important for them. Okay, let's return to this word that he uses, sanctification. Okay, so whenever Crowley uses a Christian theological term, we need to understand that these are being, as it were, hermeneutically reinterpreted, recontextualized into a magical context. So when he talks about sanctification, means that you've received God's grace through faith, and this has caused you to be released from your sin, and so therefore you're able to feel yourself to be in a condition psychologically of beatitude. And this is either the result of prayer or faith or whatever. In any case, it's one of the goals of the activity of the Christian mystic. So for Crowley, sanctification is a kind of magical illumination, a kind of gnosis that is equivalent to what he called beatification earlier in the book, but is also more or purity in the chapter on chastity. And these are all, again, states of being in the existential phenomenological sense that we've been discussing throughout the class, that place the magician in a kind of primary awareness of their true will, because they're able to psychologically intuit the wholeness of their being with a capital B. And again, this is the function of trance, the ability to transcend the more limited moment-to-moment conventional perspective that we have ourselves and gain a kind of Gnostic intuition of our being as a whole. Not just the contents of our field of experience, but some sense of the meaning of significance of the field of experience as a whole, as a totality. And then this would be incomplete and open-ended in some way that would move us towards some objective, some willed purpose that then we live in our quest for. And this is again, is the goal of thelemic magic, to attune to this ultimate purposiveness that we have access to in terms of our magical potential. So again, this would be purity, this would be beautification, this would be the condition of trance or gnosis. These are all the topics that Crowley's been talking about in all of his. So silence then is the smoothness of our attunement to these states. So then the other point here is that sanctification is something that in a Christian context is understood as being something that you receive from God through grace. In other words, it's not something that you do yourself, but you receive it from outside. And so as a Gnostic tradition, Thelema, though, is based on the idea that the grace is not received through faith or obedience to an external deity, but rather through an insight or reorientation of our own selves towards a sense of divinity that's within us, that is an expression of our own being, and that is, as it were, the divine that's within us rather than outside of us in some other supernatural world. It's within this world. We just have to tune in to it. And this is our special magical power that human beings have, that we're able to potentially do this. Okay, so then we could summarize this by saying that beatitude is equivalent to innocence, which is equivalent to purity, which is equivalent to chastity, which is equivalent to silence. And all of these ways or different perspectives of looking at trance all facilitate the free-flowing expression of what Crowley calls energy, which is the free-flowing participation through structured experience of what is called in the Book of the Law, love under will. So, and we'll talk about love, which is the next chapter in just a few moments, but the idea here is that the nefesh, the unconscious, under the guidance of the ruach, self-consciousness, can be reoriented and reorganized in terms of the drive, the psychological drive is the true will, which is then the medium of the true will. And by reorienting our unconscious material in and around the symbolism of the true will, we then disclose the wholeness or totality of the psyche, the what Carl Jung calls the self archetype, self with a capital S. And this is neshama, which is the wholeness of the psyche, that we're attempting to speculatively intuit and then project ourselves towards that visionary image, which could also be called the higher divine self, the Agoides daimon, the holy guardian angel, Horus, Rahor Kuit as the symbol or stand-in for the holy guardian angel, etc., etc. Okay, now let's look at the next chapter. which is on love, where all these ideas come together. Okay. So all the parts of the argument that had been going on in this book are now kind of combined together under this synthetic category of love. So in other words, we're seeking our true will. What's this a will to? It's a will to love on all planes. Okay, so let's try to understand what Crowley talks about here in this paragraph. Let's go back to the head of the list. Stephen, if you could read us our first paragraph here.
The formula of the Tetragrammaton is the complete mathematical expression of love. Its essence is this: any two things unite with a double effect. Firstly, the destruction of both, accompanied by the ecstasy due to the relief of the strain of the separateness. Secondly, the creation of the third thing, accompanied by the ecstasy of the realization of existence, which is joy until we develop it, until with development it becomes aware of its imperfection and loves.
Okay, so the formula of Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, is the complete mathematical, meaning symbolic, expression of love. So this is kind of the most universal formula in magic for love under will, as a kind of cyclical dialectical process. And the Yod He Vav He formula is preeminently a formula of creation, but it does have these two phases. So as a formula of creation, it's not just, although it is also, the mystical withdrawal from the mundane life world through a kind of ecstatic absorption in the mystical unity that is experienced as filled with significance and meaning the divine. Okay, so that's the mystical phase of Tetragrammaton, but it also has a magical creative expression. So it's also the coming into being of a novel set of point events, hadiths, as it were, who in turn instantiate the being, consciousness, bliss of reality, or nuit. So so it both completes a process and creates then the kether that's going to then give rise to a new tree of life, to create the magical universe of the next moment of experience. And it's creative in that sense. It's always permutating itself into new forms. So like in Jewish mysticism, the various divine names, they're always permutating themselves into new combinations. And so that's the function of Yod He Vav He. It symbolizes how language itself, as the great magical agent, is endlessly permutating its meanings, so as to ensure that the magical universe that we're within is always suffused with potential meaning in terms of the true will. We just have to discern the oracle, as it were, of that deeper meaning. And Tetragrammaton is also a formula where you revert back to the origin, as it were. So there's a kind of reabsorption back into the Kabbalistic zero, into a kind of nothingness that's experienced as a kind of joyful ecstasy of a kind of purity of being that is manifesting itself. That coincides and is also happening at the same time as this creation. And in fact, these are the 0 and the 2 of the 0 equals 2 equation. And again, the equal sign reminds us that these are flip sides of the same coin. Really, these are just two ways of looking at a single unified process of the one that is not, that is everything. Okay, so this is the dialectical both and of mysticism of magic. That is another way for Crowley to express the 0 equals 2 formula as the basis for his philosophical position. Let's skip to the third paragraph. The universe is conserved. Hillary, if you could read that.
The universe is conserved by the duplex action involved in the formula. The disappearance of father and mother is precisely compensated by the emergence of son and daughter. It may therefore be considered as a perpetual motion engine, which continually develops rapture in each of its phases.
Okay, so reality is a kind of perpetual motion machine. It's always like, as form is dissolved, new form is created, which then dissolves to then create new form. And this goes on, projected towards infinity. And so when he talks about the disappearance of father and mother, he's referring to the supernal principles, which are the functioning of the sort of Kabbalistic zero within its own dynamic. And so this disappearance is the, as it were, the negation of the negation, the pure being, which is really nothing, which then becomes becoming. And so there's a kind of disappearance of that level, because what it really is a description of a kind of the underlying pattern of how then reality is structured. But as reality actually appears phenomenally, it appears as the son and daughter. It appears as the dualities within the phenomenal life world, which are then always already in mediation with each other, and therefore reflecting into and becoming each other through a kind of ongoing process that is informed then by this structural level, which is then constantly being realized through this very dialectical process of self-becoming. This is what Hegel calls spirit, or Geist, spirit with a capital S, which is the way that reality, as it were, completes itself through its own self-comprehension, through its own self-development. And it does that through human history and human beings within history realizing that this is what they're doing. And this is called the gnosis. And Thelema is part of that realization. But then the question is, what kind of society should we then live in, given that this is the case? And that's the question then of the eon, and of then the issue of liberation of human beings within history, within the new eon. But it's all predicated on this kind of Gnostic self-awareness that it's we as human beings who are producing our own history, and then we're made by that history. And so we're the gods that we're looking for, that are creating the magical universe that we live in. And by taking responsibility for that in the gnosis and knowledge that we are the ones who are doing that, we can then reconfigure our magical universe in ways that optimize its efficiency. Again, based on then the issue of our creative flourishing in accord with our true will that we have to also figure out and define. So anyway, that's again what he's talking about. So let's now move on to this next paragraph, where it says, now it cannot be too clearly be understood. Henry, if you could start reading that paragraph.
Now it cannot be too clearly understood or too acutely realized by means of action that the intensity of the joy liberated varies with the original degree of opposition between the two elements of the union. Heat, light, electricity are phenomena expressive of the fullness of the passion, and their value is greatest when the diversity of the energies composing the marriage is most strenuous. One obtains more from the explosion of hydrogen than from the dull combination of substances indifferent to each other. Thus, the union of nitrogen and chlorine is so little satisfying to either molecule that the resulting compound disintegrates with explosive violence at the slightest shock. We might say then that in the language of Thelema, that such an act of love is not love under will. It is, so to speak, a black magical operation.
Okay, so we have this metaphor from chemistry, but the basic idea here is that is it too much to see this as a call for the diversity of love here? That Crowley is saying that the usual conventional, and by conventional he means heterosexual, standards for what love is supposed to be are too limiting for the more complicated and diverse ways that human beings can potentially love each other on all kinds of different planes and all kinds of different ways that are not certainly include, but are not limited to physical intimacy. And so there's a sense in which the social contract that holds together our legal and political institutions, at least in principle, is the expression of a kind of love under will, for example, and so on and so forth. And his point here is that if you just bring things together and it just blows up. This is not constructive. What you're looking for is to combine things together so that you get these more complex molecules, which you can then build structures on. You see, so that's the metaphor here. So again, this is a call for love as a kind of opportunity for, dare we say it, social cooperation between spiritual equals to accomplish goals and projects together. And this is the goal then of magical trance. And again, we're back to our basic theme, seeking trance rather than obsession. Obsession is this explosion, is this unsatisfying kind of blow up where things don't go anywhere interesting. And so again, there's this contrast between there is still an act of love, but it's mediocre, and we're seeking more rich forms of love. Okay, so now moving forward to the paragraph where it says the process of love under will. Let's move back up to the top of our queue. Stephen, if you could read that paragraph.
Sorry, just getting my place.
All good.
The process of love under will is evidently progressive. The father who has slain himself in the womb of the mother finds himself again with her and transfigured in the son. This son acts as a new father, and is thus that the self is constantly aggrandized and able to counterpoise an even greater not self until the final act of love under will, which comprehends the universe in Sama Samadhi.
That just means great samadhi. And the point here again is that this is the point where you can kind of comprehend the wholeness or totality of your magical universe as a kind of projective project. And this involves the self building itself up, and then it counterposes an even greater not self to then try to unite with. And Crowley is most Hegelian in this passage, the opposition, or at least influenced by German idealism as a philosophical tradition. So self and not self, that comes from Fichte. And then this whole thing about the father slays himself to find himself again, transfigured in the son, and then the son acts as the new father. That's straight out of the Hegelian dialectic, where Hegel talks about the spirit slaying itself to be then reborn in the son, like in the death and resurrection of Christ. And again, this just relates to this whole dynamic process of how the magical universe is constantly coming into being, consummating itself, dying, and then being resurrected to then restart the process as a kind of dynamic process, ecstatic process of love under will. Okay. And now, Hillary, if you could pick up where it says we must further distinguish love.
We must further distinguish love in this magical sense from the sexual formula, symbol and type though that be thereof. For the pure essence of magic is a function of ultimate atomic consciousness, and its operations must be refined from all confusion and contamination. The truly magical operations of love are therefore the trances, more especially those of understanding, as will readily have been appreciated by those who have made a careful Kabbalistic study of the nature of Bina. For she is omniform as love and as death, the great sea whence all life springs, and whose black...
Henry, if you could pick up and take us to the end here.
Whose black womb reabsorbs all. She thus resumes in herself the duplex process of the formula of love under will. For is not Pan the all-begetter in the heart of the groves at high noon, and is not her hair the trees of eternity, the filaments of all-devouring Godhead under the night of Pan? Yet let it not be forgotten that though she be love, her function is but passive. She is the vehicle of the word, of Hakma, wisdom, the All-Father, who is the will and the All-One. And thus they err with grievous error and dire who prate of love as the formula of magic. Love is unbalanced, void, vague, undirected, sterile, nay more a very shell, the prey of what object or its demonic love must be under will.
Okay, so what's he mean? So here he's making I would like to argue that a useful way to read this passage is that he's trying to distinguish between two planes, two different perspectives to view the process of love under will. And these are the, as it were, the ontic or phenomenal level and the ontological or transcendental structural sense. So there's physical intimacy, which is the ontical, and then there's, or the sex function, in other words. And then there's the function of ultimate atomic consciousness, which is the ontological sense of potentially that same act. So Crowley's point is that if you're going to have one, for that to operate magically, the sex act, in other words, it needs to be conjoined with the gnosis, or it's going to not necessarily be Gnostic. It's just going to be some physical occurrence, vulgar like everything else. So it has to be sanctified. It has to be spiritualized. It has to be under will, in other words. Just like taking psychedelic drugs can enhance your consciousness or it can lead to addiction. It's like you have to make this discernment between trance and obsession. So the supernal level of transcendental principles, which instantiate themselves in and as the existence of particular entities, namely human persons, what Heidegger calls Dasein. But this means our relationship towards our affectivity within the life world, below the abyss, as it were, is only going to achieve real magical efficacy if we can link and relate it in a coherent way to the spiritual principles that structure the transcendental horizon of being within which particular acts occur. We've got to get the big picture. And that's what magic, at least in principle, is supposed to allow us to do. So his ending exhortation to be under will, yeah, I think is an insistence that the expression of energy, which is to say libido, has to be structured not in terms of just itself, but structured in terms of a kind of second order or metastructural principle of what Freud calls the drive, which Crowley calls the true will. And that if you just remain at the level of immediate affective satisfaction, you remain at the level of the pleasure principle, and the psyche won't develop. You need the drive, you need the reality principle to open up the psyche's development. And this is what Crowley means by love being under will. I'm reading it in this Freudian sense. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's open to some questions. Questions, comments, reflection. Jump in, anybody.
Question.
Yes, Henry.
You speak a little bit more when Crowley's talking about the ultimate atomic consciousness. How does that, can you define that? And how does that sort of tie into this language-based field of reality?
Sure. Ultimate atomic consciousness is the realization that your existence has a kind of uniqueness to it that doesn't correspond to any other point event in reality's equal kind of uniqueness, but that equality is formal. Phenomenally, we all have a kind of unique expression of our true will. So what Crowley is arguing is that when he talks about the universality of these various magical formulas, the universality that he's referring to is the universality of universal uniqueness. So it's not a kind of totalitarian notion where we're all supposed to be the same. It's a call for everybody to be creatively, uniquely different, to express their own perspective, as it were. And so therefore is equivalent to, I think, an expression of Nietzsche's perspectivism vis-a-vis his philosophy of will to power, that Crowley is kind of in line with that philosophical trajectory, that's kind of position. Now, how that relates to language. Crowley defines chaos or Hokmah as the totality of the units of existence. And he defines units of existence as what he calls number. And he defines number as any unique point event. And so as the Book of the Law says, every number is infinite, because every number then has its own kind of infinitude through its own self-expression of its true will. So language is then the media, because Hokmah is then the logos, which is then what's being expressed by the understanding of neshama, which is, again, this linguistic structuring of the symbolic girdings, undergirdings, as it were, of the magical universe, within which we're trying to discern the oracle of the true will, which is then the coherent totalization of that field of possibilities that is then opened up through languaging, through our initiation into language, which opens up the phenomenological life world to us. We become initiated into language through socialization. And that's a process that can then become more explicit through magic. Magic is also a kind of initiation through what? Through symbolism, through what the Greeks call synthemata, the symbols that are used in the theurgic rites, which then, through their contemplation, elevate the soul into divine union. Or at least that's what Iamblichus says in on the Mysteries. So I'm just kind of extrapolating and showing how that connects up with certain ideas of Crowley's, particularly related to the idea of number or symbol. And then Hokmah is kind of the total, again, this totality is the company of heaven in all the star selves that make up the atomic structure of the totality, because it turns out that the totality is quantizable. It's expressed in these little non-reducible packets of energy, which then have a particular waveform, right? That then expresses a certain probabilistic potentiality for being. And so, anyway, does that make sense as a way to kind of start to relate these kinds of ideas? Does that make any sense?
Yes, that's very interesting.
Okay, because I think all these ideas are kind of linked together in this kind of common thelemic symbol system. And so Crowley's kind of playing on the organ of all of these ideas, but it's not always completely clear what he means by these ideas without reference to sort of the larger context of his, the whole of his writings and what he means in different places by that. So for example, I highly recommend, and it takes us beyond this class, but there's a really neat essay that's in his 777 collection that's entitled "What is a Number?" And it's really worth, I think, in terms of like the question that you're asking, it might be useful to take a look at that particular essay, which I think is a really good, interesting, philosophically dense essay that may help to answer some of those questions about what exactly is the role of language for Crowley in the construction of how the magical universe is created, and then also the role of symbolism, and then also of number, and why he keeps talking about magic as a kind of mathematics. That this is an essay where he kind of shows how all these ideas relate to each other, which he's presuming in this text, but he gives you a little bit more of an argument as to how he's arriving at that notion in this other essay. So I hope it's okay, and since we just have 5 minutes left, if I kind of refer you to this other text rather than trying to totally summarize it.
No, certainly that's very useful. Thank you.
I'm just trying to hit the little leitmotifs and kind of show how these ideas relate to each other, even though we unfortunately don't have the time to really go fully into depth to fully justify why this picture is coherent. So I'm just referring you to these other texts to then, you know, show you how these pieces hook together, and then hopefully we can all figure this out together. Okay, other questions, comments?
I had a question.
Stephen,
Just
please, go ahead.
yeah, so there's this sentence that at the second to last paragraph that has two different quotes in it. So for it is not Pan, the all begetter in the heart of the groves at the high noon, it is not her hair in the trees of eternity, ... under the night of Pan. Can we talk more like I feel like I understand before and after, but he's obviously like quoting very specific things here, and I could use elucidation on like
Yes,
what
context.
exactly is going on here, because I get before and after, but I don't really get the point that's being driven home here.
Okay, so the hair of the trees of eternity. So Nuit is the goddess, and she has her hair, and so the idea is that each of the hairs is like a filament of being, and so again would be the Hadit atomic unit that makes, those would be the different hairs that are on her, that are then the filaments of reality. You could see this might have some association with like string theory, for example, in if you want to go there,
Sure.
in quantum mechanics or something like that, that the basic filaments are stuff of reality. And that symbolism aligns with some of the visions in the Vision and the Voice, where often Crowley will see a particular like magical animal, and he'll talk about how its hair, each of its hairs represents like a different like component of reality. So that symbolism also occurs in the Vision and the Voice, and is worth comparing to the particular passage about my hair, the trees of eternity, which is, of course, I think it's in chapter 1 of the Book of the Law, where Nuit is talking about her hair. Okay, so Pan is the all, the whole, the totality. But then and so that's the 2 of the 0 equals 2 equation. But then that's also equivalent to the night of Pan, which is the Kabbalistic 0, the nothingness that's so absolute that it negates itself. And that's what Crowley calls the night of Pan, is the Kabbalistic 0, which is the ultimate principle that underlies the supernals, at least in his mature philosophy. So so then he's talking, what's being talked about here is that so that there's then these components which are Pan, the all, which then has Nuit and Hadit as its 2 phases. And these are Nuit, and then her hair, the filaments of which are the Hadit points that are then the atomic units of her totality. And then that's both Pan as the all, the 2 of the 0 equals 2 equation, which is also the night of Pan, which is the 0. Does that make sense as to how these ideas kind of coordinate?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was more a definitional thing that like I'd always associated the Pan with the all, and I assumed Night of Pan to be the opposite, but had not heard that.
It's more the dialectical flip side. So it is the opposite, but it's the opposite that is also the thing. So in dialectics, everything is what it is in virtue of, in some sense, also at the same time being its opposite. And so this is the point that Crowley is kind of making with the Kabbalistic 0, where he takes that to kind of its ultimate expression, which is that the shunyata, or nothingness, or the ultimate nothingness of the Kabbalistic 0 is also all of reality through its own self-convolation, through its relating to itself through this formula of tetragrammaton, which is the general formula of creation. That makes sense? A little bit, maybe?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okay, Hillary, did you have anything you wanted to ask or say before we close out?
No, I'm just sort of wallowing in all this information.
Okay. Joseph, I don't know if you have anything you want to add or say. You it's fine for you just to be here. Okay, that's cool. All right, it's gonna be, oh, go ahead.
Oh, just say thank you. It's been
Okay.
very interesting, but
Okay,
nothing to
great.
add.
Oh, wonderful. All right. So we're coming up on 4 o'clock, so I'm going to end the class. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. Next week is our final class, where we have our last chapter, which is on truth, which we've been headed towards. Remember, these are little essays towards truth. And now we're going to finally reach what Crowley defines as truth, which is going to basically re-summarize the book. So we're going to do a close reading of that chapter, where we're just going to start at the beginning and go to the end and sort of go through it. And again, re-explain everything in terms of all the ideas that we've already been discussing. It'll just be a chance to sum everything up. So everybody have a nice week. Thanks for coming by. Love is the law. Love under will.
93.
93.